Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Firstly, this is the third meeting of the postgraduate seminar series, but we now have a new name, and we are called G-SHARP, which is Graduate Seminars in History, Archaeology, Religion, Philosophy, and Social Sciences. So under the new banner, first talk, we have Megan Kimmelshue, who will be presenting her paper titled Landscape, Literature and Memory, Dinas Dinlle and the Fourth Branch of the Mabinogi. Megan is currently doing an MA in the Celts at Bangor University, which is an interdisciplinary study through archaeology and literature. She did her undergrad in English literature at Portland State University in United States. Before we start, once again, I'd like to remind everyone to have your microphone and cameras off for the entirety of the paper. Once the paper is done, we'll have a discussion session where you will be welcome to raise any questions or any comments. One way to do would be to write your name in the group chat or say that you have a question and I can call you out, and you can turn your camera and your microphone or just your microphone on and ask your question. If you would not like to do that and still would like to ask a question, you're more than welcome to leave your question in the group chat, and I will be raising that question during the discussion session. For anyone who would like to watch this seminar at a later date, we will be recording this seminar and putting it up on the YouTube channel at least 2 weeks from today. Without much further ado, I would like to introduce Megan.
Thank you. I'll share my screen. All right. Hopefully you can see that.
Yeah, it's working.
Okay. So thank you for that, George. And this evening, I am presenting a little bit of the research I have done that is exploring how and whether cultural continuities could persist on a very fluid level through the action and reaction of social or collective memory. And this is evidenced through the interactions between the Iron Age enclosed hill forts of northern Wales and the incorporation of these monumental landscapes in early medieval Welsh literature. Specifically, looking at the last half of the fourth branch of the Mabinogi and its incorporation of the northwestern coastal hill fort you see on the screen there of Dinas Dinlle. As it is a very unique coastal fort, both in environment and location. So this is, or was, and continues to be an interdisciplinary study, which looks at both archaeological evidence and literary evidence, and attempts to find where the two might constructively converge, as well as I feel demonstrates the dynamic relationship that exists between literature and landscape as types of media that shares and creates and helps to evolve cultural and social memory. So like I mentioned, it is within the fourth branch of the Mabinogi that we see convergences between literature, engagement with landscape, and possible processes of preservation and transmission of cultural or social memory. And I argue that this continues throughout the first millennium AD. Although it remains crucial to keep in mind that the Mabinogi and the collection of tales within the larger Mabinogion are sophisticated literary pieces of work, of artwork really. But it's equally important to consider that material culture, both monumental landscapes and monumental literature, can stand in proxy for memory and meaning. So considering the significance of specific features in the landscape, is an exercise in what Patrick Ford calls narrative attention. And this is a concept he contends has been overlooked in some analyses of medieval Welsh tales. So narrative attention, Ford says, means simply observing those parts of the narrative that receive considerable attention from the author or redactor and those that receive little. It also means that apparently irrelevant matter introduced into the text, however brief, is probably there for a reason and deserves our attention. So building on Ford's view, it was clear to me that geography and landscape created a strong sense of place within the fourth branch. Alfred K. Sievers, in his study of reading the landscape of Wales as a central character in the Mabinogi, argues that within the four branches is a dialogue between Christian cosmology and older narratives of ancestral relations to the land. And he argues these narratives are mediating between the physical land of Wales and early medieval Welsh cultural concerns. However, I would also argue that this mediation between land and culture is not isolated only to a Christian cosmological context, but this process is present in all communities in some form, and we find that within archaeological evidence, and it is a human and not solely religious concern. The incorporation of prehistoric sites as significant places within these tales are often given mythic or liminal qualities, and this reinforces Sievers' reading of the tales as a process of knitting ancestral lore and land together. So while much study has been done and still to be done on this process of creating a spatial cultural narrative within this medieval literature, I looked specifically at the Iron Age hill fort of Dinas Dinlle, as it is given as the home of the mythic hero G-SHARPSS and his association with Gwydion fab Don, and considering the dynamic relationship between the Iron Age landscape and the mythic tales. So what is memory, first of all? Or cultural memory. They're sometimes used interchangeably. Within literature, you'll see a cultural memory, collective memory, social memory, but really pared these down using Astrid Earle and Anne Rigney's definition. So cultural memory as a useful umbrella term to describe the complex ways in which societies remember their past using a variety of media. Van Dyke and Alcock, in their collection Archaeologies of Memory, define memory as the construction of a collective notion about the way things were in the past. So in both literature and archaeology and these studies of memory, it is important to note that memory is mutable, it's nonlinear, it's active, ongoing, and is often used to assert authority. So both landscape and literature in this way can act as a medium for memory. So before I move into considering the location of Dinas Dinlle, it's also important to state that tracing continuities through a linear historical approach is now recognized to be, on the whole, unlikely. And I would say few contemporary scholars would still argue for direct, unbroken cultural links from the pre-Roman Iron Age through the medieval period, and within the content of the surviving early Welsh manuscripts that we possess now. So if you've heard the term window on the Iron Age, that's not really what I'm talking about here. This is a non-linear conceptual approach. And however, I would suggest that this does not mean that cultural continuities are non-existent, or that there are not, as Miranda Green has proposed, persisting actual mechanisms of continuity. For example, through memory and its very real impact and action within a community. And this memory is created and sustained through interactions with the previously mentioned various kinds of media. So my line of inquiry was grounded in the approach of the Annales school. So that's initially a method of historiography with many conceptual variations, and admittedly at points quite theoretically blurry, but there are strengths to it as well. And one in this instance being Fernand Braudel's proposal of the 3 temporal wavelengths of time. One being termed la longue durée, or the long time span. And this refers to those long-standing and deeply entrenched mentalities of structure and thought. So the strength of the Annales school, according to John Bintliff, and which I agree, is its call for a truly interdisciplinary collaboration on exploring and analyzing past societies. And this also offers a powerful argument for a closer merging of sister disciplines. So how could continuities persist from the late prehistoric period and through the early medieval period? One reason for this may be found within the concept of a long Iron Age, mostly argued for along the basis of archaeological evidence. So if we consider a long Iron Age in our area considered in the 4th branch of the Mabinogi, first we look at the traditional British Iron Age. So it's generally categorized as the 800 years roughly, very roughly, between 750 or 600 BCE and AD 43 to 48. This is after Barry Cunliffe's system of dating Wessex excavations. And there is a radiocarbon plateau that makes dating between 810 and 400 BC difficult. However, as both Kate Waddington and D.W. Harding contend, areas that were mostly untouched by Roman authority require a different system. And within these areas, the Iron Age classification may extend well into the historic period. For example, in some areas as late as AD 800 in areas of Atlantic Scotland, and further north into Scandinavia. In Wales, the chronology appears to be somewhere in the middle. Like southern Britain, southern Wales appears to have been more influenced by Roman occupation than this area of northern Wales. And timescales used really must be applied in a general sense, and it must be continually acknowledged that these chronologies are an academic construct, however useful they may be. Through his work in northern Britain, D.W. Harding argues for what he terms a long Iron Age, primarily in Atlantic Scotland, which follows the Atlantic Zone framework, which you can see in this map here. And it kind of flips the map on its side and shows, particularly linked through trading routes, what the Atlantic Zone may have looked like. So the Atlantic Zone framework is a theory that consists of an Atlantic axis of interaction along the northwestern coasts of Europe. And this Atlantic orientation leads us to consider whether these communities positioned along the Atlantic seaboard shared cultural similarities over a different time span. And for both the Scottish and Northern British archaeological chronologies, it's common to view the Iron Age as part of a much larger period of development than is found further south. And additionally, the interactions here with the Roman army is increasingly seen as possibly an insufficient reason to mark the end of the period within the 1st century AD. So in Wales, this is particularly interesting because in the north, we see that between the 1st and 4th centuries AD, it might have not been all that dissimilar to the situation in southern Scotland. Now, in northern Wales, Romans built around 9 well-networked and visible strategic forts. Traditionally, this would envelop Wales into theories regarding Romano-British culture and influence, yet there have continued to be challenges to the actual influences of Romanitas. And according to Barry Cunliffe, the settlement pattern of North Wales appears to have been little affected by the events of the late pre-Roman Iron Age in the southeast of the country. And sites continue to be occupied well into the Roman period with little evidence of significant change. The Gwynedd Archaeological Trust also states that in parts of Wales, Roman influence was marginal and the native culture and styles of settlement continued. Not only did native settlement and architecture continue, but hillfort trends seem to continue as well. And not all defended earthwork sites are now thought to be necessarily prehistoric or solely prehistoric. The difficulty, however, in studying hillfort trends within this period is due to only a small proportion of these sites being excavated in any detail, and their dating is often conjectural. So, however, given all this evidence, it seems that occupation patterns and their persistence in some sort of form for centuries into and past the Roman period, sometimes even into the early medieval period, that there seems to be a degree of possible social and political stability. And this stands in marked contrast to the Southeast, where there's more evidence for dramatic dislocations. So considering this evidence, it appears possible or plausible that the term a long Iron Age may be applicable on some levels to areas of northern Wales. Now, that comes with a caveat, of course. So when arguing for the application of a term like the Long Iron Age, there are challenges, because if you are sticking to a model of unchanging, constant, recurring cycles, it has to be recognized that communities continue to be dynamic and innovative and well connected to other areas and to the continent as well. So now that we have talked about the concept of the plausibility of a long Iron Age, let's look at Dinas Dinlle in more detail, and then we'll move on to the fourth branch and take a look at the literature. So Dinas Dinlle is a majorly defended Iron Age settlement. It's constructed on a hill created by glacial movement during the late glacial period, and it's positioned on the coastal plain at the mouth of the Menai Straits, with a view of the Llŷn Peninsula and southern Anglesey. Similar to hillfort construction found elsewhere, Dinas Dinlle features monumentality in the form of its boundary construction. So it has a polygonal enclosure, high inner rampart and outer terrace rampart, divided by a deep ditch. And you can see run along here. Now, this was excavated in 2019 due to the extreme coastal erosion that has been happening, and it's believed that it's lost about a fifth of the site already, and that it may be completely eroded anywhere from 200 to 500 years, I believe is what the Cherish project projected. So the fort is estimated to have measured approximately 230 meters north-south by 145 meters east-west, and would have originally enclosed an estimated 4 hectares. But like I said, 1/5 of the site has been lost to ongoing coastal erosion. A survey by Gwynedd Archaeological Trust determined that the original ground beneath the Iron Age ramparts are still visible within the heavily eroding sections. And their survey also noted traces of circular or rectangular structures within the eastern area of the interior, proposed to be a possible Bronze Age burial mound or even a Roman lighthouse or tower, but still are unsure. Finds within the fort include Roman coins dating 80 to 53 to 296, and it also indicates possible occupation or use within the Roman period. And a very limited excavation in August of 2019 uncovered a portion of a large roundhouse, and it is estimated to be the largest stone-built roundhouse found in Wales thus far, measuring 13 meters in diameter. So further evidence detected by geophysical survey suggests the possibility of roundhouse clusters both to the south and to the east edges of the inner ramparts. And you can trace the ramparts along here, and then this is where the entrance was believed to have been. So to the south of the fort, there is a zigzag, or noted a zigzag anomaly on the survey that may possibly indicate a roadway leading to the fort entrance. And the geophysical survey and limited excavation suggests that it would have likely been a village setting with multiple roundhouses inside. And like other roundhouses of this size, it would have taken significant human effort and significant access to natural resources to have constructed the buildings and the outer defenses, including the entrance, if there was a gateway, and trackways. So you see to the south of the fort are field systems with boundaries. And along with later field systems, and there is also a settlement that was demolished in the 19th century. So the significance of the site, and you can see from this map up here, the significance of this site is pretty plain to see. It's a coastal location there, and it is proximal to the Roman outpost up here at Saguntium. But whether the site had continuous occupation through the Roman period is unknown. So coming up here into the Menai Straits. So challenges to understanding this site are also due to evidence that shows major 14th century storms relocating large volumes of sand which accumulated in the hill fort, which altered its appearance. And then during the site's main construction and occupation period, the environs would have been an estuary type landscape, and the sea would have been set out a further 1 kilometer from its current point as we see it now. The main transport is thought to be most likely by sea, although Dave Hopewell and Louise Barker note evidence for possible timber trackways leading across the plain and into the fort. However, trade through Atlantic sea routes were well established by this period, and this is demonstrated by further south, a Greco-Roman lead anchor stock found off Port Belen on the Slane Peninsula, dated to 1st or 2nd centuries BC, or even the 1st century AD. So this discovery shows that Mediterranean vessels may have been present in Cardigan Bay, although the full extent of Roman engagement is still largely unknown. Earlier descriptions of Dinas Dinlle in Archaeologia Cambrensis shed light on prior understandings of the site during the 19th century. We found written there, situated upon the verge of the Irish Channel and almost in the center of Carnarvon Bay, the western part of it is washed by all the higher tides. It not only commands the bay itself, its creeks and harbors, but also has a boundless prospect towards the main ocean or Irish Channel, insomuch that no vessel can pass to the southward without being observed by those who keep a good lookout at their station. And on this lower picture here, you can see the view towards Anglesey, the southern part of Anglesey right there. In the 19th century, Dinas Dinlle was described by Pennant and Williams as a Roman encampment, and at that time the authors claimed they were still able to make out ruins made of round stones and earth, along with ditches, ramparts, and entrances. Pennant proposed that the fort was of Roman origin and constructed as an easier landing place rather than navigating the difficult entrance to the port at Saguntium, stating, "For the entrance into the port of Saguntium is often, even at present, very difficult, much more so in earlier times of navigation." Later assessments of the site were proposed that the fortification was likely not Roman as previously believed, but was then classified as decidedly British. The wider environs of the camp confirm the significance of the site's location, as earlier interpretations were described by early antiquarians and archaeologists as a station for the commander-in-chief. An early 20th century record of British camps within the journal described the location of these camps along the coastline and classified them all as being built according to a similar model, and they were established before Roman presence. So interpretations of other Iron Age hill forts, which have been traditionally thought to be types of political centers, are helpful to consider when looking at a site like Dinas Dinlle, and even though we do not know all that much about it. Taking its environs into consideration and its positioning along the coastline, Dinas Dinlle certainly appears to evoke a vocabulary of power, a term that Oliver Davis uses as an inherent description of hill forts, or an inherent quality of hill forts. And Barry Cunliffe's reminder is also helpful, that ultimately Britain is an island and the sea a highway. This is particularly relevant to a site like Dinas Dinlle, as there are few coastal forts found in proximity to this site or in northern Wales on the whole. Similar to other hill forts in Britain, Dinas Dinlle is located in a prominent position that is visually dominating in the surrounding landscape, and the scale and the architecture of the boundaries place them as key media for symbolic activity. And the physical enclosures create a specialized space set apart from the fields and other surrounding unenclosed farmsteads. Gary Locke, in a move beyond Davis's vocabulary of power, argues for the power of emotion in the creation of hill fort sites, arguing that hill fort construction moves beyond merely defensive functions. Through the various building and repair phases of boundary spaces, the difference between life inside and life outside remains an important focal point of the community. Again, due to the very limited excavation, a look at hill forts with more extensive excavations within the fringe zones of Britain are helpful to consider. Those being sites mostly found in southern England in Wessex. So we have Cadbury Castle in Somerset, excavated by Leslie Alcock from 1966 to 1970. We have Maiden Castle in Dorset, excavated by Sir Mortimer Wheeler and Neil Sharples in Sir Mortimer Wheeler in the 1930s and Neil Sharples in the 1980s. And then Danebury in Hampshire, excavated by Barry Cunliffe between 1969 and 1989. So considering Dinas Dinlle in view of other hill fort data as a part of a possible vocabulary of power confirms the likely social significance of the site within its locality, while it also appears to share in the larger phenomenon of hill fort construction. So these three developed sites, Danebury, Maiden Castle, and Cadbury, all share four features considered consistent with hill fort definition. We have defenses, which are also structures and part of the landscape. We have enhanced storage capability, usually through enhanced grain storage, through pits, or potential structures that we find through post-hole evidence, evidence of industrial activity, periods of dense settlement, organizational similarities, and the suggestion of possible shrines or ritual activity. However, these defining characteristics and the roles they played would shift in importance throughout the Iron Age and into the historic period. So a site with an extensive record continuity is the site found at Cadbury. And John Barrett proposes that the residential Iron Age communities, like those found at Cadbury, had created for themselves a form of common history, perhaps even linking themselves to some founding ancestor or lineage, and that history will have lain firmly in a mythical past, which could be recalled orally through memory and storytelling. The later establishment of a Roman period community and the possible creation of a new identity through the construction of the temple or shrine suggests that despite a new order coming to power, the hill at Cadbury continued to be included in the stories and meanings associated with the site. Evidence from the early medieval occupation of Cadbury suggests the later establishment of a high status figure, with this occupation ending approximately AD 600. Leslie Alcock argued that the presence of imported pottery and glass make it possible to assign a probable drinking and feasting hall to this period. Later dates for use of the site are also suggested through numismatic and ceramic evidence, with an active mint there from AD 1010 to 1020, and pottery found in interior rubbish pits tentatively dated to the 10th and 11th centuries. However, the evidence for unbroken cultural continuity at Cadbury in a linear fashion is still speculative. Looking briefly abroad at larger hillfort patterns, Oliver Davis compares Danebury with the Heineberg in southwestern Germany and offers an interesting perspective on the possibility of larger European patterns. While Davis recognizes that similarities would not be due to direct cultural contact or exchange, he suggests the term synergies, as communities appear to be evincing similar responses to similar problems, particularly those resulting from social tensions that develop when transforming previously dispersed rural societies into increasingly centralized forms. If synergies existed between Danebury and the Heineberg in Germany, despite the distance between them, it would then also be plausible to at least consider parallels between a site like Danebury and the other sites in Wessex and a smaller hill fort like Dinas Dinlle. If, as well, hill forts are some sort of manifestation of identity and giver of authority, Davis helpfully offers some questions which apply to our consideration of a long Iron Age. Whose authority and whose power is embodied through the creation of the use of these sites? Through this exploration of continuities, looking at memory, landscape, and literature, I would argue this question posed by Davis remains of central importance in formulating our interpretations of both the Iron Age community of Dinas Dinlle and its inclusion within later literature. While the meanings given to hill forts no doubt change over time between their initial construction and when later literature was written down in manuscript form, it became still and remained a place with a type of cultural authority within cultural memory of the area. So now we leave the Iron Age and we move into the early medieval period and consider why a site like Dinas Dinlle would continue in the consciousness or enter the social or collective memory of the community, and consider the possible reasons why and how. So we'll look very briefly at the text itself. So known as the Mabinogi, which is a collection of 11 tales, given, which is actually a modern title given by the 19th century translator Charlotte Guest. They are a collection of tales found within 2 surviving manuscripts, and they are categorized as containing the corpus of Welsh literary material. We have the White Book of Rhydderch and the Red Book of Hergest. Daniel Hughes estimates the date of the White Book to be approximately AD 1350, and the Red Book is dated later at approximately AD 1382, between 1382 and 1410. However, it is within the White Book that we have the first evidence that brings the 4 tales known as the Mabinogi, or the 4 branches of the Mabinogi, together in manuscript form. And it is within this text that it is seemingly creating a carefully planned anthology. And the White Book creates the canon known as the Mabinogi. So the tales are not attributed to an author, and translator and scholar Shauna Davis suggests that the text may have been a part of the collective memory of the period. It also may be that within the tales of the Mabinogi, there are reflexes of an older Celtic tradition, as suggested by Patrick Ford. And this is a point that continues to be argued by scholars. Yet the setting of the tales is what is most interesting, and they are deeply rooted within their bioregion. As local place within an oral culture is described by David Abram as being the very matrix of discursive meaning. So it is the landscape that grounds these tales. This is also where the role of the storyteller, and unfortunately for time constraints, that issue will have to sadly be left to the side. But the role of the storyteller, it could very well be crucial to the persistence of traditional material, even while acknowledging that the function and form of material changes over time. But the storyteller is, like the oral stories, firmly rooted in their place and references material that reinforces regional concerns and values of the people. John Ballard's translation of the Mabinogi and accompanying photographs display the geographical precision, as he terms it, of the tales. And he observes, it can be hard to differentiate at times whether the countryside is an embodiment of these tales or the tales are an explanation of the land itself. Let's look briefly at the last half of the fourth branch, when the character and happenings of the hero Lle Llaw Gyffes takes center stage. And I'll give a brief rundown of the plot as well. And in the tale, Lle and his magician uncle and father figure, Gwydion, spend the majority of their time traversing the land. And in the fourth branch as a whole, there are 44 place names mentioned in a mix of geographical locations, onomastic stories, and administrative districts. However, I will address the locations within the tale that are associated with Lle, specifically those that may have had a prehistoric association or some sort of association that might place it within the concept of a long Iron Age. Now, while the political realities or the administrative settings reflect the political realities of early medieval period, it is of interest to me that both prehistoric and Romano-British sites also make appearances as significant places. And these places are often liminal or divinely associated. After Lle's mysterious birth and first years at Caer Dathol, he's taken to Dinas Dinlle, with the literal meaning being given by Ian Hughes as the town of Llew's fort, or Dinas Dinlle, until he reaches maturity. And this yellow star up here is thought to be Caer Dathol, which is the modern day place of Carnarvon. Down here, he comes to Dinas Dinlle. And the tale is translated by Shauna Davies, and it tells us that he was brought up until he could ride every horse, until he had matured as regards appearance and growth and size. So the location of his early years at Caer Dathol is not actually a known site, but from the text is clearly positioned in Arvin and with proximity to the Menai Straits. J.K. Ballard suggests Caer Dathol might be located at the Iron Age hill forts of Caer Engen or Craig Dinas, although Saunders Lewis and Ivor Williams both agree that the site of Carnarvon is the most likely location. And Ian Hughes admits this is possible, as the author of the tale may well have avoided all reference to Roman sites or the Roman period of Britain, and so chose an unknown name. Hughes also points to the evidence within the tale as Gwydion and Lle go for a walk between Caer Dathol and Abermenai, noted on the map right there. As they make their way to Caer Aranharad, which is right down here, and pass through Kevin Clydno, it's thought by Hughes to be located between Clynnog Vawr and Pant Glas. To be down here. Caer Aranharad is a rock formation off the coastline, and in modern day is visible at low tide, however, with no structural evidence. Right here. Although in the tale it is reached by Gwydion and Lle by both horse and boat, and might interestingly confirm some of our evidence regarding shifting coastlines, although there is no direct evidence for that. After securing a name and weapons from his mother Arianharad, Math and Gwydion notoriously conjure a wife for Lle out of flowers, with Lle leaving Dinas Dinlle and setting up court at Mir Castell. which is over here. Bring my mouse over here. And this is, interestingly, the site of a Roman military fort in use between approximately AD 78 and AD 130, and its medieval name being Castell Tomen y Mur. And there are varying aspects of use continuing well into the 20th century at this site. After surviving an attack with a poisoned spear from his wife's lover on the banks of the river Kinvail, this black line here, Llw shapeshifts into an eagle and escapes to Arvon to Nantllw, which means lose valley or lose stream, in Arvon here, where he is discovered by Gwydion and nursed back to health back at Caerdathil. When he is healed, Llw returns to Mir Castell to challenge his wife's lover, Gronw, at the banks of the river Kinvail, defeating him by throwing a spear through a stone and breaking Gronw's back, finally taking the second possession of his land and eventually becoming lord over all of Gwynedd. And Gronw's stone, Llec Gronw, is right here. So within the fourth branch, we see a wide array of place names and geographical locations. This interested me from an interdisciplinary perspective because from a phenomenological approach, place is never simply passive or inert, existing as merely a setting. David Abrams suggests that within oral culture, place may be felt to be the source or the primary power that it expresses itself through the various events that unfold there. And experienced events remain rooted in particular soils, the ecologies, and the places that give rise to them. Tim Ingold argues that landscape itself tells and is a story. And to quote Ingold, he says, landscape enfolds the lives and times of predecessors who, over the generations, have moved around in it and played their part in its formation. To perceive the landscape is therefore to carry out an act of remembrance. And remembering is not so much a matter of calling up an internal image stored in the mind, as engaging perceptually with an environment that itself is pregnant with the past. Approaching the fourth branch in this way, and a site like Dinas Dinlle, and indeed extending to the four branches of the Mabinogi entire, offers, in my view, a fresh approach to considering the cultural impact of the tales. And it presents a consideration of varying but equally valid temporalities, and proposes continuities that might very well persist over a long time span through the mechanism of memory. The effects of the dialogue between a land and its people reflect the very real concerns of both the Iron Age and prehistoric communities and the medieval communities a millennia later. What I argue is that demonstrated in the fourth branch is what Sievers terms the construction of cultural continuity with ancestral traditions of the land, and acts as a landscape narrative itself that is a borderland between fusing practices, technologies, and traditions. A sense of place is created within the tales through the incorporation of ancient space, and we witness narrative places created that are merged of time and space. We see echoes of the vocabulary of power applied to the site of a hill fort within the Mabinogi in Llw's years spent at Dinas Dinlle, where he was brought up within a safe, bounded zone, protected from the outside world, and he learned to ride, soon pining for horses and for weapons. But here he was enclosed within this safe training ground, away from the volatility of the world outside. Yet his part divine nature would have associated the place with power. How long he spent at Dinas Dinlle, we don't know, although we are told he was at court at Caerdathil until he was 4 years old, possessing the magical divine quality of appearing as an 8-year-old. And he returned to Caer Aranrhod when he was a young man and ready to be armed, married, and given land. So I argue that the usage of geographical place within the fourth branch of the Mabinogi is a powerful tool of the author or redactor, and demonstrates a shift between what Chris Gosden and Gary Locke term the shift from genealogical history to mythic history, and through this process creates social memory and reinforces a collective sense of place. The distinctions between genealogical history, which would be the there and the now, or the here and the now, and the mythic history are important to consider as peoples and communities, including those in the prehistoric period, structured their contemporary world, not with the concerns of the present, but also with the complex consciousness of the past. So genealogical history, in the view of Gosden and Locke, consists of an interplay between human memory, memory devices, with the biggest memory prompt of all coming from the nature of the landscape. So while Gosden and Locke are primarily applying their theory to the Iron Age relationships with megalithic tombs, it is possible to see these mythic histories scattered throughout the fourth branch as prehistoric and Romano-British locations are reinvested as homes of divine rulers or liminal spaces. Although they have lost their moving moments, they have become part of the mythic and collective and social memory. We see this demonstrated within the physical landscape. For example, when the audience is told that the stone that Llu's spear pierced in the killing of Gronu is still there on the bank of the river Cynfil, with the hole through it. What we don't have time for this evening, but what is of great interest is the wider geography of Carnarvon Bay, and also considering the role of the promontory forts along the Welsh coastline and their relationship to other pieces of literature, particularly found in the poetry. Dinas Dinlle's close proximity to the royal court at Aberfowl on the island of Man is also of interest. So the transformation of an Iron Age site like Dinas Dinlle into a place with mythic aspects suggests an intent, a possible intent, of the author or redactor to acknowledge or link to an ancient past and fix meanings and events into the landscape that could invigorate or validate the collective memory, or even create it. Dinas Dinlle was not a space, but a place, and remained so in different forms over a long period of time. The site moved from a visible community enclosure to the home of a mythic figure, investing the place with new and continued potency. Loney and Hoyne assert that communities desire continuity with the past in order to lay the ground for the future. And the processes by which these communities create an understanding of their predecessors is primarily through memory, which is maintained intentionally and physically. Through tracing the evidence of Dinas Dinlle's origins to its literary memorialization, we witness a physical site with a very real history becoming a site with larger than life importance, taking its place within the social and cultural memory of the early medieval period. And this is just an example of a continuing place within the collective memory. You see this map from 1577 from the National Library of Wales, where on most of these maps, you'll see Dinas Dinlle noted here, even though there are no longer any structures present that we can see, and then always associated with Caer Arianrhod out here, this rock formation. So maps that you look at well into the following centuries continue to have these associations here with that.